Right now, you might have a drink in your hand, or maybe you're planning on having one tonight. But have you ever stopped, looked down at your glass of beer, wine, or whiskey, and wondered who was the first person to ever feel this? Who was the absolute first human in history to get drunk? Most people assume the story of alcohol begins some 9,000 years ago with early farmers in China or the Middle East. They picture a Neolithic villager who left a jar of wild grapes out in the rain, came back a few weeks later, drank the sour liquid, and got a pleasant surprise. But the real story is much older, much wilder, and far more evolutionary than that. To find the first soul to ever experience a buzz, we have to travel back to a time long before agriculture, long before writing, and long before humans even walked on two legs. Because our relationship with alcohol didn't start with the invention of the brewery. It starts with a biological crisis, a changing planet, and a desperate search for lunch. About 10 million years ago, the forests of Africa were shrinking. The global climate was cooling, and the vast, lush canopies that our primate ancestors called home were giving way to open grasslands. For millions of years, these tree-dwelling primates had lived off fresh, sweet fruit plucked straight from the branches. But as the trees thinned out, food became scarce. Our ancestors faced a simple, brutal choice: adapt or starve. To survive, they had to do something incredibly dangerous. They had to descend from the safety of the trees and forage on the forest floor.
Down on the ground, they found a completely different kind of food. They found fallen fruit. It wasn't fresh. It had been sitting in the damp dirt, bruising, rotting, and fermenting. In 2014, a geneticist named Matthew Carrigan at Santa Fe College wanted to understand how our ancestors survived this transition. He focused his research on a specific gene called ADH4, which produces an enzyme in our digestive tract responsible for breaking down ethanol, the active chemical in alcohol. Before our ancestors came down from the trees, their version of the ADH4 gene was incredibly weak. If an early tree-dwelling primate ate fermented fruit, they couldn't metabolize the alcohol. It would make them violently sick, ruin their coordination, and cause them to fall out of the canopy. For millions of years, alcohol wasn't a treat, it was a lethal hazard. But as our ancestors began spending more time on the ground, a single-letter mutation occurred in their DNA. This mutation altered the ADH4 gene, making the resulting enzyme 40 times more efficient at breaking down ethanol. Suddenly, the rotten, fermenting fruit on the forest floor wasn't a poison anymore. It was a massive, high-energy superfood. Yeasts had drifted onto the fallen fruits, eaten the natural sugars, and produced ethanol as a byproduct. This fermentation process actually preserved the fruit and made its nutrients easier to absorb. For the primates with this new genetic upgrade, these smelly, overripe fruits were a lifesaver during times of scarcity. While other animals avoided them, our ancestors sought them out. And this is where the very first drunk in history occurred. Imagine a small ape-like creature, the common ancestor we share with modern chimpanzees and gorillas, shuffling through the African forest floor 10 million years ago. It's hungry, and it smells something sharp and sweet. It finds a pile of overripe fermenting figs. It eats them.
Inside its body, the mutated ADH4 enzyme goes to work, neutralizing the toxins so the primate doesn't get sick. But enough ethanol still slips into its bloodstream to cross the blood-brain barrier. For the first time in the history of life on Earth, a primate's brain experiences the psychoactive effects of alcohol. A rush of dopamine floods its system. It feels a sudden sense of warmth, relaxation, and a strange, pleasant fuzziness. It had absolutely no idea why it felt this way, but its brain logged the experience as highly rewarding, and so it kept coming back for more. Over millions of years, this wasn't just a random habit, it became a survival strategy. The drunken monkey hypothesis, first proposed by biologist Robert Dudley, argues that our craving for alcohol today is a direct evolutionary hangover from this ancient survival mechanism. We evolved to associate the smell of ethanol with rich, caloric food. But that was a primate ancestor. What about the first Homo sapiens? When did actual humans get their first buzz? For hundreds of thousands of years, early humans likely stumbled into drunkenness by accident. Picture a band of hunter-gatherers gathering wild berries, storing them in a leather pouch, and forgetting about them for a few warm days. When they opened the pouch, they found a bubbling, fermenting mush.
They ate it anyway, and suddenly the entire tribe was sitting around the campfire laughing a little louder, feeling a little closer, and looking at the stars with a newfound sense of wonder. But there is a massive difference between accidentally eating fermented berries and deliberately brewing a drink. When did we cross that line?
For a long time, the standard historical narrative was simple. Humans settled down, invented agriculture, built towns, and then eventually figured out how to ferment the crops. Alcohol was a luxury that came after civilization. But remarkable archaeological discoveries have turned that theory completely on its head. In 2018, researchers excavating Rakafet Cave in modern-day Israel found stone mortars carved directly into the bedrock. These mortars belong to the Natufians, a nomadic hunter-gatherer group who lived 13,000 years ago. When scientists analyzed the chemical residue inside these stone pockets, they found traces of starch and yeast. These nomadic people were brewing beer in a cave 13,000 years ago, thousands of years before anyone had planted a single field of wheat or built a permanent home. And they aren't the only ones. Around the same time, at Göbekli Tepe in Turkey, hunter-gatherers carved massive 10-ton stone pillars into elaborate ritual circles. Right alongside these monumental structures, archaeologists found massive stone vats showing clear chemical traces of fermented grain. This has led scientists like archaeobotanist Patrick McGovern to propose a radical idea. Humans didn't start farming because they wanted bread. They started farming because they wanted beer. Think about it. Bread requires grinding, kneading, and baking. It's a grueling process. Beer is much simpler. You soak grain in water, leave it alone, and it ferments itself. More importantly, early beer was a safe, sterilized source of hydration and packed with essential nutrients. The urge to secure a steady supply of this magical, mind-altering liquid was a far stronger motivator to settle down than the desire to eat dry grain. If this theory is correct, alcohol isn't a byproduct of civilization. It is the literal catalyst for it.
So who was the first human to ever get drunk? It wasn't a king, a pharaoh, or a modern bartender. It was a survivor. It was an ancient ancestor 10 million years ago, brave enough to step down from the trees and eat fermented fruit to stay alive. And it was a nomadic hunter-gatherer 13,000 years ago, sitting in a dark cave grinding wild barley to brew a drink they could share with their tribe. Every time you raise a glass today, you aren't just enjoying a drink. You are continuing a 10 million-year-old evolutionary legacy. The cups got cleaner, the ingredients got fancier, but the impulse remains exactly the same. We just learned how to do it on purpose.